Building on your target state architecture, you now face the real question that leadership and delivery teams care about most: how you get there without breaking the business. Transition architecture is the disciplined, step by step path that connects current reality to the future destination while protecting customers, operations, and trust. When you do transition architecture well, you turn ambition into confidence and make transformation feel controlled instead of chaotic. With that purpose clear, you should treat transition architecture as a set of planned in between states that are intentionally designed, not accidental. Each transition state is a point in time where the enterprise still operates successfully, even though it is not yet at target state. Transition architecture is not simply a schedule. It is the architecture logic that explains sequencing, dependencies, risk reduction, and how value is delivered incrementally. Now that you know what it is, you can understand why transition architecture is often the missing ingredient in failed transformations. When organizations jump from current state to target state in one leap, they underestimate dependencies, overestimate delivery capacity, and discover late-stage constraints that force expensive redesign. Transition architecture prevents big bang failure by ensuring every step is stable, governable, and aligned to the direction you have already defined. With the risk of failure in mind, you begin transition architecture by defining the non-negotiables that shape every step. These include critical services that must remain available, sensitive data that must remain protected, compliance obligations that must remain satisfied, and operational processes that must continue to function. When you define these constraints clearly, you stop teams from taking shortcuts that appear fast but create long-term damage. With non-negotiables established, you now adopt the core transition mindset. Every step must have entry conditions. You define what must be true before a change can safely happen, such as stable identity foundations, consistent monitoring, clear ownership, or established integration pathways. This keeps sequencing logical and prevents the common pattern where teams migrate workloads before foundational controls and operating models are ready. With entry conditions in place, you now apply sequencing logic that leaders can understand. You prioritize foundational capabilities that reduce risk and enable reuse, because these investments make every later step cheaper and safer. You then prioritize high-value moves that deliver visible benefits early, because early value builds support, protects funding, and creates momentum across portfolios. With sequencing defined, you now design transition states that are intentionally stable. A transition state is not an unfinished target state. It is a deliberately designed architecture that works as a temporary endpoint while you prepare the next move. You ensure each transition state has clear ownership, support models, security controls, and measurable outcomes so leaders can approve it and teams can operate it. With transition states understood, you now handle one of the hardest realities in enterprise change: coexistence. Many transformations require old and new systems to run in parallel for a period, which means you must plan for data consistency, user experience continuity, integration compatibility, and security control parity. Transition architecture helps you design coexistence so it is temporary and controlled, and it helps you plan decommissioning so legacy systems are retired safely instead of lingering forever. With coexistence in focus, you now recognize that data migration is often the main constraint that drives disruption. You treat data as a transition architecture concern because it affects trust, customer experience, reporting accuracy, privacy obligations, and operational stability. Your job is to define how data moves between states, how integrity is ensured, how duplication is managed temporarily, and how the organization avoids operating two conflicting versions of truth. With data addressed, You now focus on integration because integration complexity is where simple change becomes enterprise disruption. You identify which integrations must be redesigned first, which interfaces can remain stable, and where temporary adapters may be required to support parallel run. Transition architecture ensures integration is not treated as an afterthought, and it prevents programs from shifting complexity into hidden corners that explode late in delivery. With integrations mapped, you now place identity and access at the center of transition planning. During transformation, the attack surface often increases because new services are introduced, temporary pathways are created, and teams work under pressure. You ensure access governance, privilege control, and authentication consistency are strengthened early. So transformation reduces risk over time instead of increasing it. With identity secured, you now ensure resilience and observability are treated as required foundations. Every transition step must be observable, meaning you can detect issues early, understand impact quickly, and respond confidently. Every transition step must also be resilient enough to handle failure modes, because change introduces uncertainty, and your architecture must absorb that uncertainty without major disruption. With safety nets in place, you now strengthen governance because transition journeys are long enough for drift to occur. Different programs, vendors, and teams will make local decisions that seem reasonable in isolation but can break coherence at enterprise scale. Governance through design forums and architectural assurance keeps sequencing honest, controls exceptions, records trade-offs, and ensures transition states remain aligned to target state principles. With governance set, you now address the leadership reality. Transformation is funded in stages, not as one perfect plan. Transition architecture helps you structure investment into increments that deliver measurable outcomes, reduce risk, and build confidence for the next funding cycle. You show leaders what they get at each stage, why it matters, and what risk is reduced, which makes funding decisions easier and prevents transformation fatigue. With the transition approach clear, you can now ground it in a realistic example that leaders and architects recognize. Imagine you are modernizing a customer services platform. Target state includes unified customer identity, consistent customer data, standard integration patterns, and improved observability. Your first transition state focuses on foundations. Strengthen identity and access governance, establish consistent monitoring, and define integration ownership. Your next transition state introduces a new customer interface layer, while legacy systems still run behind it, using controlled integration patterns to avoid point-to-point sprawl. A later transition state moves customer data to the new data model with clear integrity controls, while reports and downstream systems are updated in sequence. Finally, you reach a transition state where legacy components are no longer required, and you decommission them with confidence because the new operating model and controls are already proven. With the example in mind, you can now focus on the emotional side of transition architecture because disruption is not only technical. Disruption happens when stakeholders feel surprised, when outages occur without warning, when responsibilities are unclear, and when teams feel forced into risky shortcuts. You reduce disruption by defining clear transition milestones, ensuring every step has readiness criteria, communicating trade-offs early, and ensuring operational teams are prepared to support each state. As you close the lecture, you should know what distinguishes strong transition architecture from a simple project plan. High-quality transition architecture has logic that leaders can defend, sequencing that teams can execute, and governance that prevents drift. It treats security, data, integration, operations, and resilience as core design dimensions, not secondary work streams. Most importantly, It produces transition states that are stable and valuable. So the organization feels progress rather than pain. Let's now discuss the key takeaways from what you learned so far. So you can design transition architecture that delivers change without disruption. Transition architecture is the step-by-step set of intentional in-between states that connects current state to target state while protecting business continuity, customer trust, and operational stability. You begin by defining non-negotiables and entry conditions, so sequencing is safe, logical, and defensible. You prioritize foundations first because they reduce risk and enable reuse. Then you deliver high-value moves early to build momentum and protect funding. You design transition states that are stable and operable, and you plan coexistence, parallel run, data integrity, and controlled decommissioning so legacy systems do not linger. You embed identity, security, observability, resilience, governance, and assurance into every transition step, so transformation reduces risk over time instead of increasing it. As you move into the next lecture, start viewing transformation as a sequence of safe, governable steps rather than a leap of faith. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next videos in this playlist. Like this video, so it reaches more leaders and architects who are planning transformation and want to reduce disruption. Comment with the hardest part of transition planning you face right now, whether it is sequencing, data migration, integration dependencies, governance, or funding cycles. Share this video with someone who is working on transformation roadmaps, because transition architecture is the difference between controlled progress and expensive chaos.